Okay,
All right.
what page are we on? Do we know?
Good morning. Yes. Good morning and welcome to Faith Family United Church of Christ Sunday morning Bible study. We are going over the Bible basics, calling it Bible 101. We're walking through each of the books of the Bible and just hitting the topics of what's in them and what they're about. After this, we're going to go back and we'll go through and go into a much deeper look at some of the books. Today we're doing James, 1st and 2nd Peter. If you got your little pew Bibles with you,
Yes.
It's 1054, page 1054, the letter of James. All right. So the letter of James, written. This is kind of interesting. This is one of those things where scholars kind of want to date it later, and tradition wants to put it earlier. So tradition says between 50 and 60. This would have been before Paul had become very popular. So before 62, and Paul became popular in that time frame, writing the letters that he wrote. More than likely, the author is James, the brother of Jesus. That's probably the best person that we have that wrote this. And it says, James, a servant of God. We also know that James was an elder or a leader in the church at Jerusalem. Paul comes and they have a council, and James is there in Jerusalem to talk about the difference between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And there's a letter that they wrote in the book of Acts to say that Gentile Christians did not have to come and become Jewish Christians before they become Christians. Anyway, so that's probably who we're talking about that wrote this. This was a general letter. In other words, it's sent out to all the churches, not a particular church. The churches in the area, and it's addressed to the 12 tribes or Jews scattered among the nations. So for me, this kind of suggests a date later than 70 AD, because the fall of Jerusalem and the scattering of the people. Okay.
The Assyrians scattered them a long time before that.
What's that?
They were scattered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians before that.
Yeah, that is true. And we'll see that again in Peter, in the letters from Peter, how he calls it the diaspora, the dispersion. And then, so it's kind of, is this referring to the nations that were, or the Jewish tribes that were scattered during the Babylonian and Assyrian captivity, or is this after 70? So but we give it about 62 as a date. Okay. The purpose of the letter, it functions as kind of like an Old Testament wisdom. In other words, kind of like a Proverbs, it's like a Christian literature or wisdom literature. So there, and if you look in James and when you read it, you see these kind of little sayings that most Christians say today, talking about works without faith is dead. So that's one of the reasons why it says that it was kind of before Paul, because Paul was your faith. Faith is what saves you in this. And then James says here that faith without works is nothing at all. Even the demons believed. They knew the scriptures and they believed the scriptures. So that's one of the reasons why they think it might have been written before Paul's influence was upon the church. But like I said, it's kind of like a Proverbs. You read it, and you're supposed to get wisdom out of it, practical wisdom. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, James, speaking to Jews who have had the same religious structure for thousands of years at that point, they did what they did as rote memory sort of
Mhm.
things, right? So
Kind of like Christians today.
so he's saying, the book of James to me has always been, put your faith into action.
Yeah.
Let your actions be motivated by what you believe, and not the other way around. Don't let what you believe be motivated, you know what I'm saying? So,
Mhm.
he was trying to me, it was a real interesting letter to Hebrews, who always had this rote method of religious corporate worship, to really saying, let what you believe guide your actions, and not let your actions guide your beliefs. I think it was a really big,
That's interesting.
big message. That's what I've always taken away from James, especially as you think he's writing it to Hebrews. That it was at the time it was probably a really radical thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the time, yeah. That's interesting. You say that. Let your faith determine your actions, not your actions determine your faith.
Right.
And we see that in Christianity today,
Yeah.
to where we want certain things and we're going to make them happen, and then we justify our faith amongst those actions.
I've always read it as, if you have faith, you will do the works that the Lord wants you to do, because you can't not do them.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Timothy
It's who
says-
you are. It's who you are, and you have to do it.
Yeah.
I always say this, and you probably don't realize it. I hate standing in front of people giving speeches or talking to people. I hate it. But yet, I enjoy talking to people like this. And I believe that I have a message, and it just drives me to do this. So I think that's kind of what you're saying there, Bill, is your faith just causes you to do good works.
Well, it was the old argument of faith without, works versus faith, but I believe if you have faith, you're going to do good works because you want to do good works, and that'll please the Lord. I think that's what, at least it's what Timothy said, and I think it's what James said.
I think so too. I think so
do
too. I've actually heard James, this book or this letter described as a wise old uncle. He doesn't pull punches. He lays it on the line. He tells you what it's like, and that's kind of like what James is doing. And his purpose is to kind of focus everybody on being a Christian, being the person that Jesus was, trying to emulate his life of what I call life of love. So I can agree with everything that y'all said there. I think is there any other questions about Peter, or excuse me, about James?
So when I did a study of James one time with the youth, and it talks about, I am a servant of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
But what it says in the original Greek means I am a bond. Oh my goodness, what's the word? A bond something. But at the time in Greek it meant slave.
Yes.
And it was a really interesting way of putting it. When we think about slavery, of course, it was like, kind of makes you cringe a little bit. But that's the cultural construct of slavery that we have. But he was so dedicated to what he believed that he was not afraid to call himself a slave to something. We say now it has a negative connotation. If I'm a slave to, or this person's a slave to their addiction, or this or that or the other thing, but he was proud of it and wanted to announce it. So it was always a way to connect with people about how your faith should really be so integral to who you are, not just what you want to be, right?
Yes.
Anyway, it was interesting.
And that goes back to the idea of faith.
Yeah.
Your faith is so deep inside you, you cannot do the right thing.
It's also a way it's a way to test your faith.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, okay, so James, short book, 5 chapters, 3 chapters.
It's important. I suggest you
5
read the whole
5
thing.
chapters, that's right. I'm sorry?
I said it's an important book. I suggest people read it.
Yes. I like to read the James, the Peters, and the Johns because they have more of a Jewish flavor to them, and it kind of explains not only what we're doing but why we're doing it. And sometimes, like we were talking, in Christianity, we say things, Jesus saves. What does that mean?
Washed in the blood.
I'm washed, and different things like that. We say them all the time, but what do they really mean? We get into the Christian jargon. Like when I was in the military, we had all these acronyms, and we could talk and never say a real word. We'd all say acronyms, but we all knew what we were talking about. And in Christianity, they do the same thing. But do we really know what we're talking about, or are we just spewing out rhetoric, that we learned from young to now? And I think that in today's world, in today's Christianity, people that did not grow up with Christianity, they shun away from it because they don't know the language. And when they ask people that have been Christians all their life, they can't explain it to them because they just know this is what we say in those situations.
Right.
But they can't explain why we do that. And I think that kind of puts people that haven't been grown up in the church or anything at a distance. And if you go into some place and you talk to them and they have their own kind of language, and you're gonna I don't understand a word they're saying. And do you feel welcome there? Do you feel encouraged to come there? So anyway, I got off key there. 1 Peter, once again, it's the early 60s. Some scholars suggest a later date, and that later date comes from the fact that Peter says, to those who have obtained the faith, now I lost my second letter, that's why. Let me get back to the first letter. I was in the second letter. He says, to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So these are people Christians that have left, been dispersed among these Asia Minor area. And so the scholars suggest a date of later than 70, which again is the fall of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem. So,
The fall of Jerusalem was 79.
no, 70.
Okay, 70.
70, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And then, in 70. But yeah, they didn't distinguish between Jews and Christians. The Romans went in there and said, you're all Jews. And they basically drove them out and put in Roman citizens and people. So the interesting thing about the persecution, and he talks about the persecution is not as severe. So Peter is talking here about a small and being ready for the persecution. So they put it at right around 70, right after 70, so that they say that this was the beginning of the persecution. And then when you see later on, you see a major persecution, and that's what Paul talks about, and some of the other writers talk about this major persecution under Hadrian and what was the Mad King's name? Nero.
No.
So, and that was, of course, in the 90s is when you have the book of Revelation written, and that talks about the severe persecution.
When was Peter killed?
it has him being crucified before 90.
I thought before 70.
Yeah,
67 is
Yeah,
what they're
67,
saying
yeah.
here.
Okay.
so. And then that goes to what we're gonna get to next. The writing claims to be from Peter, St. Peter, Simon Peter, wrote the letter to the church in the different Asia Minor. But it could have been, or it probably was, a pseudonym written by somebody else using Peter's name.
Or
And
his
before I
writings.
get too far, let me get this. Okay. Because the Greek is very polished. And of course, we know Peter's a fisherman. However, there is a suggestion that Silas wrote for Peter. And of course, Silas or Cyrenius, is a very Greek name, and he probably was well written in Greek. And it actually says that with the help at the end in 5:12, in the end of the book when he's wrapping it up, he says that Silas, faithful brother, has written it. We have written it to you. So Silas has
Input.
yeah, he has input, and he might have been the one that actually wrote it. Peter's kind of dictating, say this, and then he's translating it and writing it into Greek. Of course, him being Greek himself, he probably more fluid and had more polished look. And when we get to First John, the letters of John, you'll see that the Greek is a lot less. You go from like a high school or a college age student writing something to a grade school student writing something. That's kind of the comparison that you would see in the different forms or the different styles of Greek. You get a sixth grader to write a letter. It's not going to sound perfect. Whereas you get a high school person or a college person to write a letter, it sounds more eloquent, more flowing, and that kind of thing. So it could have been Silas, which I would like to agree with that more than anything. That him and Peter, in their travels together, decided that they needed to write something because of this dispersion. Okay. So we see the recipients in 1:1. That's what I already said. The Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. But I like this part here. Destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ. Got them all in there, didn't they? You got the Trinity right there. A lot of people, I say a lot of people, some people claim that the Trinity is nowhere to be found in the Bible.
The three characters are, but I agree with whoever said that.
It doesn't outline, it doesn't.
It doesn't say that
The word Trinity is not.
No,
in the
no,
Bible.
the word is not found in there, but the concept is there.
I think Trinity is a construct.
Yes, I agree.
There are people from when I became a Christian, it was Christian Church of Christ, and there are lots of people in the history that refuse to use the word Trinity because it's not found in there. So anyway, so the purpose, it seems to be a lesson in doctrine covering the Christian life and duties. This idea that you're made a Christian for a purpose, kind of that idea. It's not, I'm a Christian, I'm saved. Kind of like a lot of people in Christianity today, the main goal is to get to heaven. So you got to believe in Christ, and you got to worship Christ, and so you can get to heaven because you're saved. And it's like, no, there's more to it than that. There's a purpose behind you becoming a Christian. It's not just, I'm good. Are you good? Well, I'm good, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, again, it seems to be a general letter for all churches to use as a standard of conduct. In other words, kind of like in Paul's letter to the Corinthians when he talks about the communion, he says, you know, you're not even doing it right. You're saying it's the Lord's Supper, but you're bringing full meals and you're eating in front of poor people. And so it's kind of like in 1 Peter, he's kind of putting it in a ball. And this is what we should do. This is our duties and our conduct as Christians. This is the way we should conduct ourselves. So, and that's 1 Peter. All right. Well, fast today. 2 Peter. Once again, early 65 to 68. Some suggest a much later date again. These scholars come in and which is interesting because when we get these early dates from church tradition, they're still well removed. You're talking 200, 250, 300 before they decide, hey, this was written about this time and this person wrote it. And then scholars come in who don't know and they say, well, because of this and this and this, and they bring in all this other information, we're going to put it at a much later date. Does that matter? Does it matter?
Over 2,000 years, not really.
The second thing is, the date doesn't matter. Does the author matter?
No.
When the council sat down and said what books are authoritative and what books aren't, they were also led by the Spirit to say this book is very good for the church. This has the Spirit of Christ in it. That this is what we should follow. This is the problem comes in when you have to have this date particular. This is when it was written. And this is the author. And if you don't believe that this is the author and this is the date, well then the book doesn't, it's no good. You throw it away. Because if it's the author isn't who the author says it is, and the date isn't who it says it is, then you can't believe the book at all. And that's harsh. That's harsh. That's saying, the saying, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Right?
Yeah, but so why did they have their names? Why were the names used?
To make it more important.
Okay, so you read it.
Yes. So, but taking that one step further, then the whole book has to be true 100% or it's invalid. Unfortunately, people think that way, and so they go so hard to say this is the author, this is this, and this is this, and if you don't believe that, you're not a Christian. This is the Word of God, the very words of God. No, it's words about God, and there's a difference. The Spirit of God is in them because we can see the Spirit of God. But if we think this is the very words of God, then we tend to put this on a pedestal. And guess what? This becomes your new God. And anything that's not in here is not of God. Well, we know that isn't true. Because God, we can see God in each other. We can see good things in each other. That comes from God. And so there's more to God than just this book. But to point to this has to be the author, and you get people that will argue it and argue it and argue, but it doesn't matter. What matters is, what is the message? Do you see the message of God, the love of God, the compassion of God, the faithfulness of God in these words? And that's the important thing. And so when we read this, we don't necessarily have to say, I agree with that 100%, but you have to say, I can see the Spirit of God coming through those words. Does that make sense? Go ahead, Phil. I know you want to say something.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think that the Bible is the Word of God, but it was written by man.
Yes.
So God is speaking to us through the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And there's very little, if anything, in the Bible that contradicts itself. And from Genesis to Revelation, the story is complete and it's a book. It's like bookends. And that's what I mean, there's no reason to say it isn't the Word of God. That is a phrase we use to describe the information that comes out of the Bible.
Yes, yes.
And I believe it is directed by God. And I think that you're directed by God when you interpret the Bible. And when it reads to you, or when you read it, you understand it in your conversation with God. I believe that.
What was you going to say, Sam?
Well, I have a response to that, but I'm not gonna say that. I wanted to say what I originally wanted to say. And let's look at this from a modern term. Like, someone comes up with a novel idea, for example, Einstein, the theory of relativity. It was a novel idea. He hired a bunch of smart people who made greater expansions in physics than he was capable of, but his name was on all of that because they were his tutelage. So he was on all these papers and books that were written as author when he probably had very little to do with the actual research that gained that knowledge, right? So it's the same sort of thing here. Why do we get caught up on the name and the dates? Because if they were disciples of Peter, then they probably took what Peter said, expounded it, and they were much smarter in the years that followed than what Peter knew in the beginning.
Yeah.
So it's not important to me who wrote it when it was written. What's important to me is we can see how Peter's influence made a difference in the life and what he was trying to get across to, especially Jews, and about suffering. We're not talking about when people say, I'm suffering for Jesus now. Nobody's suffering. Maybe in, not in the
Northern
mission
Africa.
field, but nobody's suffering for Jesus in America like that. So these people were really suffering. So he was trying to get the message to them. And so we take it in that context. It doesn't matter who wrote it. It's just as important today as it was then.
I agree with you. I agree with you that I think the problem that we have today, once again, this is a terminology, Christian terminology, and the word is inspired. What does inspire mean?
Someone had to write it down.
They've taken the word inspired in the Greek and broke it down and said, this is God-breathed. And so every word in here comes from the mouth of God. And I have a problem with that. First of all, you took in a word and you just completely obliterated the context. How many times do we use the word inspire today? We even use the word muse, right? Because someone inspired you to paint a picture or to write a song or a poem. And it was because of their inspiration. Now, the inspiration of the Bible, of course, is God. God of love, God of peace, God who is holy, completely different than any of us. And so when we are inspired by God, it doesn't necessarily mean the very words come to us from God and we speak as if we were God. It means that we have this understanding from God, and the words that come out are in God's Spirit.
I just want to say, I agree with everything Bill said, and I do believe that the Bible is inspired, and the Word of God comes from the Bible. However, people have perverted that saying into meaning that someone sat down and they went into a trance and they wrote
Exactly.
Because
That's
I'll
what I'm
tell you
saying.
something right now. That is exactly what I was taught in the Baptist church. So we know that's not true. So I agree with what he said, but there is, I also think, an issue in churches where they try to make the Bible a fourth deity.
Yes.
And
The fourth deity of the Trinity.
yeah.
That's
So there's
funny.
a danger there, I
Yeah,
think.
there is a danger. And then you take that one step further and you get to the point that, whose interpretation is right?
Right.
Whose interpretation? And so,
And they don't make
we
room for
need
the
to.
Spirit. They don't make room for the Spirit, because what Spirit's leading me to believe is not the same thing as what He's leading you.
You saying that the Spirit's still speaking?
I think so.
Of course.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Joe.
People say all the time, never
Yes.
put a period where God put a comma. God is still
Exactly.
speaking to us. I've met so many clergy in the United Church of Christ that have been drawn in because of the ability to understand information in today's interpretation compared to the way it was written hundreds of years ago.
And see, the problem is, we get caught up in our traditions, and our traditions are in our culture. They come from our culture. So if our culture changes, our traditions need to change. Now, the message is the same. The message is the same.
That's hard for people.
But yet, that was an interpretation for that culture at that time.
Right.
So the culture has changed. Now that's why you send people like me to seminary to be able to, what they call exegete, means I read this and I take it, not in our culture, I go back to their culture and I say, what did it mean to them at that time? Okay? And now what does that mean to us? Not to the people in the Middle Ages. I mean, yeah, that's important to see how it transformed into that. But what does that mean for us today in relation to the original, what it meant to them?
The culture changes, but the message remains the same.
Exactly. But the interpretations of it needs to change with
It has to.
with the culture. So, okay. So once again, general letter transmitting instructions to the church.
Do you need some help?
The purpose, it's dealing with false teachers and evildoers. He says it right there. Who have entered the church. In other words, those people that wanted to, okay, I'm going to change this idea like this because it suits me, and I'm going to be able to get a mansion and two airplanes and 20 cars because you guys, I'm going to be able to teach you how to be a Christian, and you're going to pay me for that. And I know that I'm taking it out of the context of their culture and put it in ours. But that's what he had. He had teachers, false teachers, and evildoers coming into the church to make gain.
We have it today.
Oh, yes, we do.
He says, use the word to discern false teachers. What's happening now is people use false teachers to discern the word. That is the problem with Christianity now. It's the
He said-
exact opposite of what Peter is telling us.
And one of the things, and see, this is part of 2 Peter, is the fact that they're in a transition period. They're in a transition. They were Jews, and now they believe in the Christ, and so they were called pagans. The Christians were called pagans because they didn't, worship the law like the Jewish people did, and the Christian religion. And so there's this change from Jewish to Christian, and then there's also this change because we're getting away from the apostles and we're going to after the apostles. In other words, the people that were there and learned at the feet of Jesus, now they're gone away. And this goes to what you were saying about who actually wrote it. It was probably disciples of Peter, maybe once or twice removed, but they still held on to his teachings, and this was his teachings. And so they attribute it to him through putting his name at the front of the book.
Absolutely.
But there's this huge change going on. And see, that's what we're talking about, this idea, now we got to move out of this tradition because our culture is changing, but we're keeping the faith the same. The faith is about love, compassion, forgiveness, all those things that Jesus taught. And so this was a book of transition.
What Greek word did he use for a church?
Ecclesia,
Ecclesia. So,
the called out ones. All right, great, thank you. Next week, we're doing, John's and Jude.
John, Jude.
First, second, third, John and Jude.